Okay, ready to dive deep into Indian democracy.
Let's do it.
Today, it's one nation, one election, the big idea of syncing up all of India's elections.
It's a big one, that's for sure.
We've got our hands on a hefty committee report on this.
Oh, and a paper focusing on the economic side of things.
And even some direct feedback from the public, which is always interesting to see.
Yeah, getting those real voices in there.
This deep dive, though, it's more than just looking at ballots.
It goes way deeper, right?
It's about power, how it's balanced, federalism, the whole structure.
And the potential for India's political landscape to completely shift.
Exactly.
What's really fascinating is this isn't some brand new idea.
Right.
India actually had simultaneous elections for a good chunk of time after becoming independent.
Yeah, I think people forget that.
Almost 2 decades. But then, well, things happen, politics.
Right.
And now it's like they're constantly in election mode.
So for anyone who isn't totally familiar, what does one nation, one election actually look like?
Picture this. One single election date.
Okay.
But for everything.
Wow.
Their parliament, all the state assemblies, you name it, even those local councils.
All decided at once. That's quite a
It
concept.
is a massive undertaking.
Especially for a country as large and complex as India.
Absolutely.
So the report, it lays out a bunch of arguments in favor of this system.
It does.
Let's start with maybe the biggest one on people's minds, the economics.
Yeah, that's usually a big driver.
What does the report say on that?
Well, they're claiming simultaneous elections could actually boost voter participation,
Okay, interesting.
lead to higher economic growth.
Yeah.
You know, the good stuff.
So lower inflation,
They say that too.
more investment.
More investment. And they say the quality of government spending would improve as well.
They even mention a study, right?
Yeah, this study suggests that India's GDP growth could get a 1.5% jump.
Whoa, that's a significant number.
It is a pretty big potential impact.
What's the logic behind a claim like that?
Well, their thinking is synchronized elections would lead to more stability
Okay, I can see that.
and predictability, especially for businesses.
Makes sense. Businesses don't like uncertainty.
Right, they need to be able to plan.
So how does that tie into elections?
Okay, so in India, there's this thing called the Model Code of Conduct.
Right. I've heard of that.
It comes into play during election periods.
Yeah.
And it restricts what governments can do.
Ah, so it's kind of like a temporary freeze on big decisions.
Exactly.
Well, why is that a problem?
Well, it can create a lot of uncertainty.
For businesses.
Yeah, makes it harder for them to plan long term.
Okay, I get it.
So the thinking is fewer elections would mean fewer of those periods.
And therefore, a more stable climate for investment.
Right, a more favorable environment overall.
Fewer elections, less uncertainty, more investment. Sounds good in theory.
Yeah, definitely appealing on the surface.
But I'm curious, are there any downsides to this model code of conduct?
Well, to be honest, the report doesn't really get into downside specifically. But you could definitely argue it might make it harder for the government to react quickly
To what?
to, unexpected stuff.
Yeah.
Emergencies, those kinds of things.
Oh, I see.
Especially if they pop up during those election periods.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that.
It's worth considering.
So beyond the whole economics angle, what else does the report say in support of these simultaneous elections?
Well, one big thing they highlight is cost savings.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Elections are expensive.
Huge expense. Think about it. All those election officials,
Right.
security forces, the logistics of moving everything around.
It's a massive operation.
And they argue doing it all at once, it could really cut down on that burden.
Logistically, yeah, I can see that.
It makes sense.
What else?
They also argue that it could lead to better governance.
How so?
Because right now, with the constant campaigning,
Yeah.
it can lead to something called policy paralysis.
Policy paralysis.
It's basically where everyone's so focused on the next election.
That they can't get anything done in the present.
Exactly. It's like they're always in campaign mode, not governing mode.
And simultaneous elections would change that?
That's the idea. Free up politicians to focus more on actually governing.
Okay. Less campaigning, more governing.
Less reactive, more proactive, hopefully.
That certainly sounds like a good thing. But we've got to consider the other side, right?
Of course. We can't just take one perspective.
What about the people who are against this whole idea?
Yeah, the dissenters?
The report includes their concerns too, right?
Absolutely. They don't shy away from those at all.
What are some of the main arguments against simultaneous elections?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is what it could do to India's federal structure.
In what way?
Critics argue it could end up giving too much power to the central government.
Interesting.
So basically, the national issues might overshadow the local ones.
Okay, I see.
And potentially, it could even undermine the autonomy that the states have.
So instead of focusing on what their region needs and who the best local candidates are,
People might get swayed more by national stuff.
by what's happening on the national stage.
Exactly, and by how popular the national parties are.
Makes sense. And this ties into the whole constitutional question, doesn't it?
It does.
Some people argue that this whole idea is actually unconstitutional,
Right, they say it goes against the very principles of Indian democracy.
that are enshrined in their constitution.
Exactly, it's a pretty big argument.
Then there's the practical stuff too, right?
Oh yeah, lots of logistical questions.
Like, what happens if a government collapses before they're supposed to have this big combined election,
Yeah, that's a big one. Would they just have to wait years for a new one?
potentially creating a period of instability?
Exactly, it could throw a real wrench into things.
These concerns get to the core of how Indian democracy works, right?
Absolutely, it's not just a surface-level debate.
And the report doesn't just ignore these points.
No, they dig right into them, acknowledge the complexity.
So what do they propose?
Well, they even suggest solutions. Like, for that government collapse issue,
Yeah.
they propose amending the Constitution.
Wow, that's a big step.
It is a huge one.
What would the amendment do?
Introduce this concept of a full term versus an unexpired period for governments.
So if a government collapses early, they wouldn't have to wait the full term for a new election.
That's the idea. Allows for some adjustments.
So there's a push for efficiency, but also an understanding that they need flexibility.
It's a tough balance to strike.
They acknowledge that amending the Constitution is a huge deal in India, though, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's not going to be a simple, quick change.
No, it'll face a ton of scrutiny, legally and politically.
This is way beyond just changing the dates, isn't it?
It is. We're talking about potential shifts to their constitution, their fundamental laws.
This is where your expertise comes in.
Okay.
Let's unpack these proposed amendments.
Sure.
And what they could mean for the future of Indian democracy.
All right, let's dive in.
Amending the Constitution, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's not a light undertaking.
What kind of legal hurdles, political hurdles are we talking about here?
You got to remember, the Indian Constitution is intricate, very carefully balanced.
Right.
It balances the power of the central government with the state's economy.
So any change to that, especially messing with elections?
It's going to need some serious thought.
Deep understanding of how it all works.
Exactly.
So it's not just, oh, add a few lines here, tweak a word there.
No, not at all. It's more like navigating a maze.
A maze of legal interpretations.
Yeah, potential court challenges you got to think about.
And, of course, debates in Parliament, lots of different viewpoints there.
Absolutely, representing the whole country.
This makes me think about the political will. Even if you get over the logistical stuff, the legal challenges.
Will enough politicians actually want this to happen?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. I mean, for something this big, you need consensus.
Not just in Parliament, though, right?
No, you got to get the states on board, too.
Because they each have their own political landscapes.
Yeah, their own interests, their own dynamics at play.
So we're not talking about convincing a few people in a room.
No, it's way bigger than that.
It's like this massive web of negotiations, compromises.
Across all levels of government, really complicated.
And that brings us to something interesting in the report.
Oh, yeah.
They look at other countries that have simultaneous elections.
Ah, so they're not totally going in blind.
Exactly. Not completely uncharted territory.
What countries did they look at?
Well, they mentioned South Africa. They do national and provincial elections together.
Okay, interesting.
But not local, so even they don't do it for everything.
Right, so there's variation even there.
And then there's Belgium. They hold elections for 5 different bodies at the same time.
5. Wow, that's a lot to juggle.
Talk about efficiency.
It's pretty amazing, logistically speaking.
But does it work? I mean, can voters actually keep up with all that?
That's the question, right? Can they make informed decisions at every level?
It seems like there's this trade-off, efficiency versus making sure voters aren't overloaded.
It's a tough balance, definitely something to consider.
And the report acknowledges that, right?
Yeah, they say that if India were to do this, they'd need a lot of voter education.
Public awareness, campaigns, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Got to make sure people understand what they're voting for.
Makes sense. Informed participation, that's democracy 101.
Right, that's the foundation.
So going back to those other countries, what do they tell us?
I mean, do these simultaneous elections change the political landscape?
Yeah, what have they seen?
Well, they offer some interesting insights. Like in South Africa, some people think their system.
With the combined national and provincial elections.
Yeah, that system has actually made their national parties stronger.
Interesting. Does that mean regional parties get weaker?
Well, that's one way to look at it, yeah.
Hmm. So for India, where regional parties have a lot of influence,
It raises some big questions.
like, would simultaneous elections shift power more towards the center?
It's definitely a possibility.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right?
It does. It goes right to the heart of that balance of power.
Between the central government and the states, that's a core part of Indian federalism.
Exactly. It's a very delicate balance.
So even though simultaneous elections are supposed to streamline things,
You could end up with some unintended consequences.
like who ends up holding the power, how it's distributed,
And that's why you got to look beyond just the logistics.
and the economics of it all.
Right. The political impact, that can be massive.
It's like we're going deeper into the rabbit hole here.
It is. It's more complex than it appears at first.
Not just about when and how you vote, but what kind of democracy you end up with.
What kind of India you're shaping.
Exactly. And this is where the public feedback part of the report is really interesting.
Yeah, what did people have to say?
They actually went out and got input from the public.
Oh, wow. So they didn't just rely on experts and comparisons.
Yeah. Nope. They got over 5,200 responses.
It's a decent sample size.
And it was split, 3,837 in favor of these simultaneous elections.
But still a good chunk against it, that 1,395 opposed.
So clearly there's some division in public opinion.
Absolutely. People aren't all on the same page.
What were the main arguments on the yes side?
A lot of them echoed what we've talked about, the cost savings.
Right.
Less policy paralysis, more focus on actual governing.
That came up a lot.
Yeah, and this idea that it would make democracy smoother, less disruptive.
So a desire for efficiency, less chaos.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
They see it as a way to strengthen India's democracy.
And maybe even speed up development.
That's the hope, at least for the supporters.
What about the people against it? What were they worried about?
A lot of them were concerned about federalism, that balance we talked about.
That it could be thrown off.
Yeah, that states might lose some of their autonomy.
And the central government could become too powerful.
It's that fear of centralization.
So they share some of those expert concerns about a potential power shift.
Exactly. They're worried about the same things.
What else?
They also felt like local issues might get drowned out.
By the national stuff.
Yeah, that people wouldn't be as connected to their local representatives.
So a fear that different regions, their unique needs,
They might not get enough attention.
if national politics are dominating everything.
Exactly. That's the concern.
This shows you that it's more than just a question of, do we combine elections?
It's about how you want your democracy to function.
How much power should be at the center, how much at the local level?
And how do you make sure people's voices are heard at every level?
It's really a deep dive into representation, isn't it?
Absolutely. Do simultaneous elections make that better or worse?
That's the core question.
Yeah.
So this debate, it's not just about logistics.
No, it goes way beyond that.
It's about the nature of democracy, what it means to represent people.
Yeah, those fundamental questions.
And that's what makes it so interesting to explore, right?
It really is. It forces us to think about how democracies work, how they can be better.
What are the challenges? How do we balance different needs?
Exactly. There are no easy answers here.
And that brings us back to that question we touched on earlier.
Oh, about separating national and local issues in people's minds.
Yeah, even if India could do all this, logistically, legally, politically,
Can you really separate those things in the voting booth?
that's a really interesting question. How do we make decisions in a democracy?
Do we look at issues individually, or do our national affiliations always influence us?
It's a question for any democracy, not just India.
Especially when you're voting on different levels of government.
It makes you think about how aware we are of our own biases.
Yeah, and how much effort we put into understanding the issues at every level.
It's a call for informed citizenship, to be engaged, not just check a box.
Absolutely. It's about taking responsibility for the choices we make.
And that's where the report's inclusion of personal stories is so powerful.
Oh, you mean where people shared how this might affect them?
Yeah, their hopes and fears, their real experiences.
Those can be really impactful, hearing those voices.
Can you give us some examples of those stories?
What resonated with you from the report?
What stood out?
Well, one that really stuck with me was from a teacher.
A teacher, okay.
She was deeply concerned about how all these elections were impacting education.
Oh, interesting.
She talked about how schools are constantly closing for voting,
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
and teachers losing valuable teaching time because of it.
Wow. Yeah, that's a disruption.
Plus, they often get pulled away to help with election stuff.
Taking them away from their main job.
Exactly. It's a perspective we often overlook.
Yeah, when we're talking about big ideas like simultaneous elections.
It's a reminder that even small changes can have a ripple effect.
Touching people's lives in ways we might not immediately think about.
Right, it brings it back to the human level.
Were there any other stories that really resonated with you?
Yeah, there was this one from a small business owner.
Okay, what did they have to say?
He was actually a big advocate for simultaneous elections.
Oh, so the opposite view.
Yeah, he was all for it passionately.
What was his reasoning?
He talked about how during election cycles, businesses are just constantly on edge.
Makes sense, lots of uncertainty.
Yeah, not knowing what policies are going to be, what changes are coming.
Makes it hard to plan for the future.
Exactly. He said it's bad for investment, bad for growth.
So he saw simultaneous elections as a way to stabilize things.
Yeah, create a more predictable environment for businesses.
So they could focus on growing, contributing to the economy.
That was his hope. Less politics, more focus on building businesses.
It's fascinating how the same issue can be seen so differently.
Depending on where you're standing, what your daily life is like.
And that's why it's so important to listen to everyone.
To all these different perspectives, because there's no perfect answer.
No solution that's going to work for everyone in the same way.
It's about finding a system that works best for the majority.
While still respecting the needs of the minority.
And trying to minimize any negative impacts.
These personal stories really add another layer to the whole debate.
They do. They ground it in reality.
It's not just abstract concepts, it's how real people are going to be affected.
And I think it's crucial to keep that in mind as we go deeper into this topic.
I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have to.
The history, the arguments for and against, the constitutional stuff.
The international examples, the
Yeah.
economics, what the public thinks.
Even those personal stories, it's been pretty comprehensive.
It's a complex issue, lots of facets to consider.
But if you had to boil it all down, what's the key takeaway?
If you had to sum it up in one sentence,
What would you say?
I'd say simultaneous elections, they're interesting, they could be beneficial, but they're not a magic solution.
Not a quick fix for all of India's democratic challenges.
Exactly. It's more nuanced than that.
Not a cure-all, no, but it's sparked a lot of debate in India.
Yeah, a nationwide conversation, which is important.
So if they decide to go ahead with this,
Simultaneous elections, big change.
it'll need a lot of thought, careful planning.
And they can't just ignore the people who are against it.
It's not just about logistics, it's about their democracy.
Yeah, how it works, what it means to be Indian.
It's pretty profound when you think about it.
It is. And whatever they decide, it'll be interesting to watch.
Other democracies will be paying attention.
Definitely. We can all learn from this no matter what happens.
We're all facing these challenges.
How to make democracy work better, be more efficient.
But also, make sure everyone is represented. That's key.
And how do you adapt to the world we live in now? Everything's changing so fast.
It feels like this topic has opened up a whole can of worms.
It kind of has, hasn't it?
It's not just about India, it's about democracy itself.
That's what makes these deep dives so interesting.
We don't always get answers.
No, but we start asking the right question.
And that's how we learn, how we grow.
Exactly. We push ourselves to think critically, to really engage.
So as we wrap up this look at one nation, one election,
Any final thoughts for our listeners?
what should we be thinking about going forward?
Well, we've talked a lot about India, how this would change their politics.
Right.
But I think there's a bigger question here,
Okay.
one that goes beyond borders.
What's that?
How do we, as citizens, deal with politics today?
It's a different world, isn't it?
It is more complex, everything's connected.
Information overload, it can be overwhelming.
So how do you make your voice heard?
How do you make sure you're represented?
These are the questions we should all be asking.
It's a call to action, right?
It is. Democracy isn't a spectator sport.
You can't just sit back and watch.
You got to be engaged, pay attention, hold your leaders accountable,
Fight for what you believe in. Make your voice heard.
and keep pushing for a better world, a more just world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This deep dive has shown us one thing.
What's that?
Even small changes, like when you hold elections,
They can have a huge impact.
on how your democracy works, who has the power, how people participate.
It's a good reminder that every vote matters.
Every voice matters, every action you take,
It's about understanding the system
and then using that knowledge to make a difference.
to shape the future you want to see.
Well said. So thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been a fascinating one.
We've explored one nation, one election in India.
What it could mean for them, and maybe even for the rest of the world.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions.
And keep diving deep.